The past often arrives not as a single headline memory but as a cluster of small things. The soft pop of a jar lid releasing, the way a knitter tugs the yarn at the end of a row so the edge does not slacken, the ritual of folding a napkin into your palm before offering someone cake so the hand that took it has that small, guarded courtesy. I remember those motions with the precision of habit because habits outlive declarative memory. Memory wears gloves. On May 18, 2012, after the service, those gloves lay out like evidence on the kitchen table. We gathered in the house on Willow Lane, Ruth's house, purchased in 1957 and held through decades of changing neighbors and weather. The windows tilted inward at the top, one side of the sink drained more slowly than the other. Sunday felt like a hinge in that house. What I had been carrying privately for years hardened into public shape that afternoon, and the ordinary objects around us, jars, recipe cards, taped reels, a shawl, became actors in a family law drama that was, in its essentials, about how people try to keep what matters from unraveling. Ruth was born in 1924, the eldest of three, and came of age during the Depression and the war years. That context is not sentimental background, it made her methods concrete. In the 1930s and 1940s, recipes were technologies of survival as much as aesthetic choices. In that world, to teach a neighbor how to cut a root vegetable so nothing wasted felt like civic work. In 1951, as television began to enter American living rooms and AM radio still threaded regional conversations, Ruth began broadcasting. Her programs, modestly syndicated and aired on a local station from 1951 until roughly 1966, slotted between the farm reports and the baseball scores. She spoke about cooking, household thrift, and neighborly care in short segments, moving through lists with the practiced authority of someone who had lived through both scarcity and abundance. Those broadcasts rooted her voice in the town's shared texture. When years later we digitized some tapes, the reels smelled of celluloid and rooms that had once been warm with heat. The late 2000s sharpened her concerns. The Great Recession of 2008 to 2009 had taught many families how fragile ownership could be, how quickly a house that had sheltered 3 generations could become a commodity on the market. Ruth feared hasty decisions made under grief, the suddenness by which anchors could be lost. She wanted to prevent a hurried sale of the house she had tended, to keep jars from being fought over, to stop a last conversation from turning into a first fight. In 2009, after a decade of conversations with a lawyer she trusted, she set up a trust that reflected a life formed by public and private labor. The instrument unspooled conditions and protections meant to untangle problems before they tightened into fights, to distribute objects where they would be useful, and to prevent a rushed sale. The trust was modest in material terms: one house, a few boxes of letters, reels of tape, jars, and the small savings that come of thrift. But its contours were larger than its balance sheet. Ruth's bequests were less monument than promise: jars to family and the Historical Society, radio tapes and recipes to the local station, and a small scholarship in Aunt Margaret's name for a local student interested in the culinary arts. The trust aimed to keep not merely property but a set of practices alive. Its legal scaffolding could point the way, it could not hold hands at the table. When the trust closed in 2011, the work of translating legalese into life began in earnest. Law, after all, is prose, not touch. The document did what it was meant to do practically: it distributed assets and set directions. We wanted the directions to be lived, not merely enforced. In November 2011 we convened around the largest table in the bakery. Not in an office, but where people could smell yeast and butter. We read aloud Ruth's handwritten explanatory letter, line by line, odd mixtures of stubbornness and tenderness, pragmatic rulings and small ceremonials. She did not lecture, she explained. Hearing it read softened something in the room. Those who felt boxed in found context, those who felt left out had a chance to be heard. The meeting set a precedent: when a document has teeth, narrative and public witnessing should be the soft tissue around it. It is important to place these decisions in time. In 2009 the trust was conceived. By 2011 it had been closed. On May 18, 2012, after the service, the family gathered around Ruth's kitchen table and the objects that mattered were clarified into inventory and intention. In the months that followed, beginning in the spring of 2013, my sister and I began to film a documentary about the house and Ruth. We filmed because the quirks of her trust and the ways she had tried to keep family together felt like lessons beyond our lane. lessons about how legal instruments and human attachments meet and sometimes miss. We did not stage a tidy reconciliation. The film's closing sequence is deliberately plain, my father setting the percolator on the stove until the pot begins its click, Aunt Margaret's shawl folded on a chair, my mother arranging lemon squares as if composing a small altar, and me at the counter, kneading dough until it is smooth. The camera holds on the dough until the distant sound of a crust forming in the oven finishes the scene. No voiceover overlays that moment. Instead, an old radio tape runs beneath the action, Ruth telling a joke she used to tell on air. During the credits we show one of Ruth's recipe cards, the looping script at the bottom, where late in life she added a line that felt like both signature and request, leave instructions, not restraints. That line is the closest we could come to summing her intention, without flattening it into a slogan. Filming in spring 2013 taught me how much the past is a set of linked practicalities as well as feelings. We worked through spring and summer, capturing domestic acts, watching how daily routines could be both rehearsed habit and archive. We edited in the late summer of 2014 and early 2015. Our first screenings were modest and local, the town hall in October 2015, the public library in November, community colleges, and then a university seminar in March 2016. Each screening became an occasion for conversation. Audiences arrived with questions in 3 registers: legal, moral, personal. In May 2016, a lawyer from a nearby city asked if I would speak to law students about the ethics of conditional gifts. A public history class debated whether Ruth's method was paternalistic or protective. I told them what the kitchen had taught me: intent must be visible to be judged fairly. Whoever draws the map should, when possible, be asked to walk someone else along it. While we cut the film, the bakery continued its everyday work. Each morning I measured ingredients and patience in equal portions. Customers came and left with a pastry that, for a few minutes, tasted like repair. The bakery is not compensation, it is daily work. I answered parents' phone calls, labeled jars, and took down Aunt Margaret's old tapes in the right light to listen for the moment a laugh landed the way it had when I was small. Presence became the trust's practical counterpart, not paradoxical freedom but a harder contract: show up. Archiving Ruth's radio tapes became careful labor beginning in late 2013 and stretching into 2015. The local station lent both equipment and expertise. Students from the community college, audio engineering majors and public history students arrived with notebooks. Retirees came with patient hands and memories of reel-to-reel players. A woman who had worked in an acetate factory could, with a practiced ear and thumb, clean a spool until the hiss receded. We catalogued interviews and jokes, recipe instructions and the occasional cough that made Ruth's sentences feel present and breathing. We labeled reels as invitations rather than evidentiary artifacts and arranged them so someone could listen without needing a legal advisor to interpret motive. The Historical Society preserved some material. The station housed a selection. I kept a small stack of recipe cards in my apron for days when I needed to remember an exact fold or a phrase Ruth always used. The archive created landscapes for both nostalgia and conflict. Old arguments returned like unspent heat. My parents, people who had gradually learned small acts of kindness, still had days when voices carried brittle distrust. My father would sometimes ask quietly, with the look of both hope and accusation, if I thought Ruth had been right to limit certain gifts. I tried to answer without taking sides. There were protections that kept some things from descending into chaos, and there were fences that felt confining. We learned to name feelings first: betrayal, relief, confusion, before legislating solutions. Naming became a new kind of mapmaking, a way to redraw lines with consent rather than edict. From the period after the trust's closing in 2011 through the first screenings in 2015 and 2016, we layered rituals beside legal ones. In the bakery we established an annual Recipes and Reasons Day, hot cider, a sign-in sheet, a short program, so the trust would not be an inert sheet of paper but part of a practiced habit. A clause that required the house to be maintained meant nothing unless someone explained who would be reimbursed for window repairs and who would volunteer to mow the lawn. The rituals: public readings of Ruth's letter at these gatherings, a table for family questions, a notice board for recipe exchanges, were attempts to turn the legal into the lived. We recorded short audio letters, segments of Ruth's voice where possible, or readings by those who loved her, so that the why behind a decision could be heard as well as read. We set aside a day each year to share food and explanations, an unthreatening ritual where people could follow up in a room where eyes met and voices did not require mediation. Not every dispute yielded to ritual. In spring 2014, a cousin contested a jar of blackberry jam, arguing that the will favored another branch. Another argument focused on an old sentence setting aside a small sum for house repairs, concrete to someone who had slept in the attic as a child. These arguments often began in the kitchen and then went quiet. Sometimes they needed mediation. Our method for convening remained simple and persistent. An open chair at the big bakery table, coffee, a copy of the Trust and Ruth's explanatory letter read aloud, and a chance for each to tell what they felt and wanted. Often a small promise followed: share the heirloom dish for a year, split a jar, agree a schedule for repairs. Practical compromises and gestures toward being seen diffused many fights. In 2015, a sharper dispute arrived when another cousin demanded a small box of family letters and threatened legal action. The box was physically small but carried leverage beyond paper. We convened and read the letters aloud so words would be witnessable. Public reading diffused the idea of singular ownership. As the letters became shared heir, their value as leverage diminished. We arranged a compromise, a shared digital archive with access policies agreed in writing, and a public affirmation that the letters would be used for context and connection, not private advantage. The compromise moved property toward stewardship. These conflicts taught practical lessons that I began to share more widely. Leave more than a ledger, I would say. Write an explanatory note that functions not as justification but as a compass rose. Here is why I steer this way, here are my fears, here are my hopes. Imagine being wrong. Consider who will live with the consequences and give those people a way to speak back. That humility moves a paper from trap to guide. In March 2016, at a public seminar, I told law students and community organizers that a will with explanation is not merely technical. It is the start of a conversation that begins before the testator dies and must continue afterward. The bakery itself became something of a custodian, not merely of pastries but of public history. Word of the film, the recipe events, and the ritual of sharing spread. In 2016, a woman 3 states away wrote to tell us a stew recipe her grandmother had made during wartime had resurfaced when she read about our recipe nights. She said the stew had helped her forgive and ask for forgiveness. Martha, the neighbor across the lane who had known Ruth for decades, organized a cooking circle in summer 2017 that paired seniors with teenagers. They worked in odd combinations so stories could cross generations. Retirees' meticulous measuring met teenagers' facility with apps and social forms. The politics of kinship, legal instruments and human frailty, kept unspooling in ways I had not anticipated. The scholarship in Aunt Margaret's name brought Lena into the bakery in the summer of 2016. Lena had freckles from long afternoons in the sun and an impatience that was almost tender. She wanted to learn pastry because food was the language her family continued to speak even when other subjects were left unsaid. We mentored her partly as instruction and partly as permission. We taught her how to fold an apricot tart until its edges held like a promise. She taught us to let a recipe flex when life required it. In Lena I saw a living sentence of what Ruth might have intended, an investment that continued rather than concluded. Legal and ethical conversations traveled with the film. In November 2016, I sat on a university panel arguing that restrictions in trusts are not inherently bad, but they become weaponized when divorced from explanation and human context. We advocated modest, practical steps. Name a contact person responsible for convening a family meeting within a year of an executor's appointment. Record short audio messages explaining the reasons behind decisions. Include a small budget for convening. These steps are inexpensive and often more useful than an extra legal clause. Between 2016 and 2019, the town adopted small rituals for easier transitions. Family readings became public and ritualized. Butter cookies, a sign-in sheet, a place to ask questions. We recorded more of Ruth's voice. When we played segments in workshops, "This is Ruth, 1962, explaining how to jar peaches." We then tried the recipe and let voice and food meet anew. Someone unfamiliar with Ruth's marmalade could listen, fold peel into boiling sugar, and for a moment know how humor, timing, and taste combine to make a life audible. The tapes, once hissy and private, became pedagogical. Not all disputes yielded to homegrown rituals. A jar dispute in summer 2017 flared and required professional mediation in September. We arranged the room as we always did, a table intending equal status, a neutral facilitator, and a set of small practical moves: split the jam, agree on a borrowing schedule, set deadlines. The mediator translated claims into day-to-day costs: who fetched the jar, who insured the house, who took responsibility for maintenance. When a legal claim became a practical list, common sense often followed. The bakery's dry erase board by the door tracked special dietary needs, upcoming classes, and a slot for recipe cards for our monthly recipes and reasons session. The board filled and emptied like a tide. Mr. Hill bought bread every Saturday and refilled me on small-town news. Nor came for almond biscotti and taught me a phrase in her mother tongue in exchange. A teenager who had come for a first job returned years later to ask for advice from the scholarship recipient. People arrived with the day's weight and left lighter because someone had listened. It is both mundane and, in its repetition, holy. Letters arrived from strangers. In January 2017, a woman in Ohio wrote that she had used a pie to apologize to a brother after 20 years of silence. The pie did not replace the apology but made the meeting possible. In September 2016, an elderly woman in Vermont wrote that reading Ruth's explanatory letter gave her courage to leave a short recorded message for her children explaining why she planned to give certain books to the local library rather than to family. These correspondences pointed to a broader hunger for making inheritance less a battlefield and more a continuing conversation. One of the roles the archive played was pedagogical. Students from the community college began to use the tapes as class resources in spring 2015. They learned spooling, metadata, and the miracle of sound restoration. How a cough can become a story and how a lost phrase can be coaxed back from the hiss. The woman from the acetate factory taught ritual precision for cleaning spools. The tapes became workshop resources: play a segment, attempt the recipe, let voice and food meet anew. Private moments in that stretch were often the most human. One summer in 2017, an elderly couple brought in a recipe box their mother had left and discovered they had different memories of the same dish. The minor disagreement opened into stories about apartments and coping strategies. The recipe became a prompt for shared life storying. That was the point. Once people read aloud, the archive became a way to re-inhabit the past together. The documentary continued to travel from 2016 through 2019. At a regional film festival in July 2018, a woman asked whether, in retrospect, we would have done anything differently. I said yes: record more letters in plainer speech, include in the trust an explicit requirement for a family meeting no later than a year after execution, name a steward and attach a small budget for maintenance. Hindsight is a luxury. We did what we could. The point was never to bulldoze the past but to make fewer surprises for the next people in line. Then came the pandemic in 2020. The ways we convened rearranged. Recipe nights became small, socially distanced porch exchanges and, when public health permitted, masked gatherings with distanced chairs. We posted recorded explanations online for those who could not come. Making the why audible had an exponential effect. One recording could be listened to by siblings 3 states apart who would otherwise never cross a county line. We did not solve everything. There were nights a cousin still wished for a different distribution and neighbors who found certain clauses too authoritarian. But the rituals, shared meals, recorded explanations, a named convener, did more than reduce litigation. They offered a social contract that softened legal rigidity. A will with explanation is not a cure for grief, but it is a salve against surprise. Small acts kept things alive: the percolator clicking awake at dawn, dim light through the front windows, dough faintly smelling of yesterday's yeast. People came with maps folded in their pockets, a man with an address on a worn card he no longer planned to visit, a woman with a grocery list that doubled as a confession, a teenager carrying a note from a parent who wanted a simple cake for a modest funeral. For a few minutes compasses aligned. We traded pastry and consolation and returned to separate routes with a little more direction. Some disputes required formal negotiation. In February 2018, a cousin filed a narrow suit over the trust's small repair fund, not about the money so much as recognition. We negotiated in March and reached a practical settlement: a schedule of repairs and a named, compensated steward to arrange bids and sign checks. The solution acknowledged that a clause requiring maintenance also required a person to do the maintenance, and that person should not be expected to do it for free. That thinking softened some edges. In April 2019, at a community center event, I proposed a simple policy idea. Any trust might include a named person and a modest budget for convening a meal within a year of an executor's appointment. Set aside $500, pick a volunteer, set a date. Small things that make surprising differences. These are not legal fixes so much as social ones. They ask less of courts than they do of neighbors and family members. Show up, bring food, and explain. Our archival work yielded unexpected generosity. Community college students came in spring 2015 and stayed to learn spooling and metadata. The woman from the acetate factory taught a ritual precision for cleaning spools. Workshops formed, play a segment, attempt the recipe, and then discuss what it meant to hear a voice that could no longer be interrupted. The tapes became classroom and kitchen. Some of the most urgent lessons were procedural and small. Tape an explanation to the inside cover of an heirloom book. Record a short video where you explain what an object meant to you and why you want it to go a certain way. Name a person tasked with convening a meal within a year of an executor's appointment and give them a small sum to pay for it. Create rituals, a public reading of a letter, a sharing of recipes, a scheduled check-in. These social scaffolds require humility and curiosity about the discomfort of others. They make legal instruments less likely to feel like iron gates. There are basic housekeeping lessons that emerged from practice. Make maintenance footprints visible. If a trust requires an object be kept in the family house, ask who will dust it, insure it, and use it. Add maintenance instructions and a named steward compensated for the work. When we applied that thinking in the settlement after the February 2018 suit, it softened sharp edges because it recognized maintenance as labor, not merely intention. Companionable domestic clauses matter. My partner and I keep a list. Who calls the doctor, who drives to the clinic, who answers the neighbor's late-night calls. We update it, we do not notarize it. The unspectacular repetition of these acts is a daily law that binds more securely than a notarized clause. That practical ethic, the slow, ordinary work of being present, turned out to be Ruth's most enduring lesson. The question of whether Ruth was controlling comes up often. My answer is simple and chronological. She feared the world's capacity to unmake people she loved. Her solutions were humane if imperfect. She wanted to protect and to stop cascades of poor decisions, though she could not foresee everything. The moral we learned is procedural. Pair instruments with explanation and a promise of conversation. Companionship is the human chassis for policy. The scholarship we funded was small and local but rippled outward. Lena, who arrived in 2016, worked and learned and then returned to teach teenagers. She told me the scholarship was the first time someone had explicitly given her permission to be what she wanted. That permission was not merely money, it was a communal nod, an extension of hands into the future not as instructions but as openings. Community responses kept arriving long after the trust closed. Between 2016 and 2019 screenings and workshops drew questions that cut three ways: legal, moral, personal. People wrote that the story prompted them to do uncomfortable things: an apology over a pie, a recorded message explaining book donations, a family meeting convened within months of an elder's death. The small, practical steps we advocated, a short explanatory note, one named convener, a budget for a meal, a recorded message, made ordinary differences. The archive remains alive. The Historical Society catalogues the digitized tapes by date and subject. Recipe cards are tagged, jars labeled, from Ruth made 1974, and sent to family with a line, "We saved some for you." That phrase is itself a ritual of translation, not merely instruction but an offer. When the cameras are off and the oven's cool, I tuck Ruth's recipe card with its last marginalia, "Careful here, tastes like summer," into my apron like a talisman. My fingers remember the pattern of kneading as if it were a childhood lesson. Sometimes I speak aloud to the card, "Did you mean this?" The motion of my hands answers clearer than words. The map metaphor persists because it helps. Maps imply direction and orientation but not weather or private choice. A map without annotations is often more dangerous than useful. The The work is annotation. Add the why behind the where, make notes naming who may need a thing and why, place arrows back to the maker. If puzzled, call me and I will walk you through this. That humility and openness turns a directive into a tendency, a suggestion rather than a wall. The things we began in the early 2010s, digitizing tapes, holding public meals, creating a small scholarship, continue beyond episodic disputes and repairs. The cooking circles Martha organized in 2017 continue to pair generations. The Historical Society keeps the digitized tapes accessible. The bakery remains a place where, for a few minutes, compasses align and hands trade pastry for direction. If someone is making their own map now, my advice is practical and chronological. Set aside time in the years before you go, talk to a lawyer as Ruth did in 2009. Write a handwritten explanatory letter, close the trust and be present to explain what you meant, as we did in 2011 and as the family gathered on May 18, 2012. Record a short message. Name a person to convene a meal within a year of the executor's appointment. Set aside a small sum to pay for it. These small, practical acts do the heavy, ordinary work of easing the burden of decision. Ruth's handwriting still peeks from the drawer. Her loops and slants are like a weathered coastline. The map on the wall bothers some of us because maps assume more certainty than is possible. But when I stand beneath it and hold the compass in my palm, I feel a duty not to let a document carry all the human work of being human. Documents are scaffolds. They are not substitutes for conversation. The inheritance that proved most necessary and most human is not simply the house, the jars or the tapes. It is the practice. Leave instructions, not restraints. Pair clauses with ritual and named stewards. Record a voice that can explain why. Keep convening the table. My hand stays on the compass. The bakery keeps the light on. The jars keep summer sealed. And somewhere a tape from 1962 plays and laughter rises. We practice returning to the table and explaining why we set the place the way we did. That practice, repeated over years and seasons, is the living inheritance Ruth intended. By the time the pandemic rearranged our rituals in 2020, Ruth's project had already left a visible trail of decisions and small precedents. Those choices, what she left to whom and with what explanation, had been litigated, gathered into archives, debated in kitchen circles, and translated into a handful of practical habits. What the virus forced was not invention so much as acceleration. Practices that had been emergent and local became necessary and codified out of convenience and safety. In March 2020, we recorded a longer sequence of tapes and posted them with transcripts. The pandemic made transcription urgent. People who could not attend a masked porch exchange needed to read as well as hear. A transcript is a different way of making a voice legible. Pauses, emphases, offhand asides appear on the page and invite annotation. We added timestamps and a short guide. If you want the recipe, skip to 7:12. If you want the story about the town fair, start at 23:48. Those pragmatic signposts were an extension of Ruth's original ethic. Help people find the why so they would not mistake instruction for permanence. The mechanics that Ruth had quietly insisted on in 2009. Talk to a lawyer, name a steward, provide a budget, convene a meal, proved resilient. In 2021, the County Historical Society received a small grant to fund continued digitization and to hire a part-time coordinator. Lena, who had come through the scholarship in 2016 and then returned as a teacher, took the coordinator role. She built a modest dashboard on the Society's site, dates, who spoke, who cooked, where the jars had been sent. The dashboard was not tech for tech's sake. It merely made the scaffolding visible, who had responsibility for what and when a convening had last occurred. That visibility mattered because obligations that live only in the imagination are easily neglected. A clause that required maintenance but neither named a responsible person nor provided a budget had been the source of much friction elsewhere in our region. Ruth's trust did both. She named a steward and attached a modest repair fund, an insight that had resolved the 2018 dispute because the settlement followed the trust's logic and compensated labor. Seeing the calendar and entries on a public site reduced animus. It was harder to claim desertion when a volunteer had logged every trip to the house and every bid received from a contractor. Our local bar association took notice in an informal way. In October 2021, a probate attorney contacted me and asked permission to include an adapted version of our convening clause in a handout for clients. Name a convener, include a line item, require a convening in the first year. The handout was not a law, it was a conversation starter. Over the next 2 years, more attorneys in the county began to offer advice that sounded less like an ultimatum and more like a checklist for civic care: records, explanations, named caretakers, small budgets for community rituals. Personal reckonings continued to orbit the legalities. The central grievance that had set some of this work in motion, the fact that my parents had kept me from Ruth's deathbed, did not resolve itself through clauses and meals. It required conversation, and conversation is the slowest and most unpredictable procedure. In 2012, I had left with documents in my pocket and a trust in my name. The years that followed held both estrangement and reconnection in uneven measures. In June 2021, during one of the hybrid meals that had become our preferred format, I asked my mother to explain why she had banned me from the room in the last days. She hesitated. The cameras were on. Several relatives dialed in. The convener, Ruth's steward by name, a woman we call Joanne, had set the hour and the menu. The meal was an act of ritualized listening more than a banquet. Soups in little bowls, Ruth's lemon cake cut into modest slices, a tape played halfway through where Ruth herself said, "If you cannot be in the room, be at the table." My mother spoke then with a mixture of regret and self-justification. She said she had been afraid that old wounds would reopen around a fragile bed. She said she wanted Ruth to have a quiet death, a memory that was held by only a few. She acknowledged that the choice felt right at the time and wrong now. She apologized without theatricality, the sort of apology that accepts the limitations of words. We did not, at that dinner, arrive at full reconciliation. We did, however, move the relationship forward a few inches. After the meal, several cousins who had never met me in person sent private messages, some cautious, some tender. That small shift was not a legal act, it was what Ruth had wanted when she asked for explanation and convening. The archival work refined its methods. By 2022, the digitized tapes had been catalogued according to metadata practices taught to volunteers who came from community college courses. We added an element, the intention tag, a short line the speaker recorded explaining why they wanted an object to go to a particular person. Because he taught me to fix radios, or because she was the only one who liked spicy pickles. The tag made inheritance less abstract and less prone to contest. It did not eliminate grudges, but it made disputes more specific. Is this about sentiment, use, or acknowledgement? Stories accumulated. In February 2022, a man in his 30s who had grown up 2 states away flew back for a convening after seeing a recorded explanation about a set of well-worn mismatched chairs. He sat, traced the patina with a finger, and said he understood why his aunt had wanted them kept in the house rather than sold. He was asked to be the household steward. He refused at first, citing a job in another city, and then agreed to visit quarterly and to hire local help when necessary. The trust's maintenance fund covered his trips. That arrangement, partly sentimental, partly practical, could not have been concocted from a will alone. It required an ongoing commitment fostered by Ruth's insistence that decisions be accompanied by conversation. Not everything went smoothly. In September 2022, a neighbor contested a clause authorizing the shipment of preserved jars out of the county. The neighbor's complaint was small and procedural. They wanted to challenge the use of a public road for a commercial crate shipment rather than a private handoff. It seemed petty until we realized the complaint was an outgrowth of grief misrouted as regulation. We mediated and changed logistics. Jars would be delivered personally for the first year, and thereafter shipped under the steward's supervision. Small accommodations like that resolved large simmering resentments because they showed flexibility and care. The pandemic's hybrid forms became creative instruments. For a convening in November 2021, we mailed kits to people who could not attend, a slice of Ruth's lemon cake frozen, a sealed jar of her pickles, a photocopy of a recipe with her notes, and a QR code linking to the tape. The convening itself had 8 people around a table and 25 on screens. At a prearranged moment, someone played a tape where Ruth said, "Open your jar now." The physical and the virtual synchronized across distance. That is the sort of choreography Ruth had wanted in her trust, the recognition that not everyone can be in the same room but that everyone can be part of the ceremony. Institutionally, our model began to be cited as a case study in a local eldercare conference in 2023. I spoke about the ethics of explanation and the craft of naming stewards. The talk was not an academic triumph so much as an affirmation that procedural smallness can be powerful. A social worker in the audience told me she had adapted our convening clause for a client's estate plan. The clumsy, human accuracy of that moment, the idea that one family's messy practice might help another, was exactly Ruth's aspiration, practical, not prescriptive. Other families we worked with took her lessons and translated them differently. One family adopted Ruth's record the why practice and posted explanatory videos in a private cloud account. Another set of siblings used the convene within a year clause but changed the convener to a local clergy person rather than a family member. The forms adapted because Ruth's focus on conversation rather than command freed people to imagine practices that fit their contexts. Meanwhile, the legal paperwork that had once felt like a battlement softened into instruments of invitation. Executors still had duties, lawyers still filed forms, and occasionally tensions flared. In late 2023, an interpretation dispute arose about whether the maintenance fund could be used for a new roof or only routine patching. The steward proposed a plan, the siblings argued, and we mediated. The solution, a vote threshold among living beneficiaries and an emergency clause for structural urgency, tracked the spirit of Ruth's choices. Whenever authority was exercised, it should be accompanied by explanation and by opportunity for conversation. Those procedural fixes had human impacts. A woman who had not spoken to her brother for 10 years attended a convening in April 2023 and, after listening to a tape where Ruth gently rebuked siblings for quarreling, reached out to apologize. It was not a universal remedy, some relationships remained estranged, but the practice of convening created moments where reconciliation could be offered and sometimes accepted. Ruth's handwriting continued to appear in small places, a note pasted to a jar lid, a scrawl in the margin of a recipe, a line in the trust describing who should convene. Her script had become a cultural artifact. People sought it out as if it were a map, not of territories but of intentions. On the 10th anniversary of the Trust's execution in 2021, we held a modest anniversary meal and played the first tape from 1962. People who had been children when Ruth died were now parents themselves. The meeting was less about ownership and more about lineage, who we had become in relation to the habits she had tried to make contagious. The practical mechanics matured. The steward set up an annual report by 2024, repairs done, meals convened, tapes digitized, jars distributed, and a small ledger of expenditures. Transparency reduced suspicion and invited accountability. The steward's compensation, modest but explicit in the trust, acknowledged that care and coordination are labor. That recognition mattered not just materially but psychologically. It said that the emotional work of holding memory is work like any other and worth remuneration. There were deeper cultural shifts, too. The notion that inheritance could consist of practices rather than merely objects slowly entered community conversations. High school history classes used the archived tapes for lessons about domestic life and memory. A local newspaper in 2022 ran a feature on how families were using recorded explanations to avoid disputes. These were small ripples, not a tidal policy shift, but they pointed toward a different expectation, that the living owe the living more than forms, they owe them orientation. Personally, I continued to carry the complicated inheritance of being named in a trust while having been kept from a deathbed. It never became a simple story of victim and victor. There were continuing moments of grief and anger, old stitches that would not dissolve. There were also unpredictable kindnesses, a late-night phone call from my father in 2022 after a convening, a note from my mother in 2024 enclosing a photocopy of one of Ruth's recipe cards with her own penciled note, "Try less sugar this time." Those small gestures were not redemptive in a grand sense, but they were incremental and real. As the archiving project expanded, we wrestled with preservation ethics. Tape quality degrades, formats obsolesce. We decided, deliberately and chronologically, to refresh the digital files every 5 years and to keep a physical copy locked with the Historical Society. In 2023 we established a rotation plan so that stewardship would not rest forever on one person's shoulders. Those institutional redundancies acknowledged mortality without trying to pretend we could make memory immortal. The Trust's more public legacy emerges in the modest changes it fostered, more wills with explanatory letters attached, more trusts that name conveners and budgets, more local attorneys suggesting social scaffolds rather than only legal ones. None of these changes was dramatic or guaranteed, but they were cumulative. They shaped how people understood obligation, that it includes explanation and the design of a conversation. By 2024, the bakery that had been part of Ruth's life remained lit in the mornings. The percolator still clicked awake as it had for decades. A teenager who had attended summer baking workshops in 2017 now managed the ovens on weeknights. She kept a copy of Ruth's apron with the recipe card tucked in the pocket. The practice of returning to the table persisted as a living habit rather than an archival principle. Looking forward, the work is neither finished nor final. Legal forms can provide architecture, but they cannot guarantee the goodwill or curiosity required to use it kindly. What we taught ourselves and have tried to teach others is procedural and human. Name someone to convene, give them funds, record a brief explanation, and keep returning to the table. Those acts do not eliminate pain, but they do make it navigable. There will be more disputes, more awkward meetings, and more private reckonings. There will also be more convenings, more tapes transcribed, and more jars labeled and sent to hands that will open them and find some are preserved. Ruth's trust did not remove the past. It created a set of practices that allow the past to speak for itself and invite the living to listen. That, in the end, was her intent, to leave not merely property but a method for carrying memory forward so that the next people in line would inherit not only objects but the means to explain them and to gather around them when explanation is most needed. In the spring of 2025, the rotation plan we had sketched in 2023 began to feel less theoretical and more like a responsibility with a timetable. The steward, who had been doing the coordination since 2019 and whose modest compensation was explicitly budgeted in the trust, invited an alternate to shadow the work for 12 months. That handover plan was written into an appendix added after the roofing dispute of late 2023. It read like the sort of cautious, chronological instruction Ruth favored: name a successor, train them for a year, and require a joint report in the successor's second year. The idea was to avoid the all-too-common failure mode of ad hoc caregiving collapsing when a single person grew old or ill. On May 1, 2025, the steward and their named alternate filed the first co-signed report: repairs performed, 2 convenings held, 32 jars distributed, and a modest stipend paid to a local student intern who had begun cataloging the tapes. The intern program had itself emerged from a small dispute the previous autumn. In October 2024, a sibling had argued that the maintenance fund could not be used to underwrite educational outreach, because the trust's language was, in their reading, strictly about household upkeep and distribution of objects. The steward countered that Ruth's convening clause, framed as an instruction to bring people to the table, implicitly supported efforts to teach others how to convene. The mediation in November 2024 produced a compromise. Outreach could be funded as a one-off if it served the trust's purpose of preserving and contextualizing objects. The steward proposed an internship program with a local community college, and the siblings approved it in a split but decisive vote by January 2025. That vote became a small precedent. Where the legal text was ambiguous, the family preferred a test of practice over a reheated contest in court. That practical bent animated other work. In March 2025, the local historical society completed cataloging the copies we had deposited in 2023 and announced a low-cost public archive day in June for families interested in learning how to preserve oral histories and fragile paper. The archivist emphasized chronology and provenance, paper etching dates, tape types, digitization formats, and refresh schedules. We demonstrated how Ruth's handwritten notes, marginalia on recipes, a faded shopping list taped into a cookbook, could be scanned with minimal handling and annotated in a field called provenance commentary so future users would know who wrote the note and why. The demonstration drew 27 people, several of whom later adapted the practice of keeping explanatory notes with heirlooms. It was precisely the modest diffusion Ruth had hoped for, not an imposition but an example. On a personal level, 2025 continued to be a year of uneven reconciliations. My parents had remained a complicated presence. Their earlier gestures, my father's late-night phone call in 2022, my mother's photocopy of the recipe card in 2024, were neither full absolutions nor mere politeness. In February 2025, my mother attended a convening for the first time since Ruth's deathbed episode. She sat at the table in the bakery's back room, eyes fixed on a tape that contained Ruth's voice recommending less sugar in a particular loaf, and she cried in a way that was both apology and admission of loss. After the convening she lingered, and in a voice that carried the awkwardness of someone practicing new habits, she said she was glad the trust had made them meet. She did not offer an explanation for why she and my father had closed that last door years before. She offered instead a willingness to sit at the same table and be witnessed. For me that willingness mattered, small and insufficient as it was, because it converted a previously sealed history into a shared action. It also left open questions about the past that could not be answered. Why exactly they excluded me from Ruth's deathbed, what fear or loyalty or shame had driven them, and whether explanation could ever be full enough to repair what was broken. Courts remained a distant option, but not a frequent one. In June 2025, the neighbor, who had argued about jar shipments in September 2022, filed a second, different complaint. Place between March and July 2025, underscored a lesson we had learned the hard way: ambiguity invites suspicion. Ruth's trust began, by design, to collapse ambiguity into conversation. By the mid-2020s, the tapes themselves had taken on new political life. In April 2025, a local high school used a group of Ruth's 1960s domestic recordings in a course on family history. The assignment asked students to contextualize domestic economies in the late 20th century: grocery lists, canning practices, the economics of running a small bakery. Teachers reported that the students found a kind of unassuming rigor in Ruth's explanations. They were less startled by the presence of a living person in the archival record and more curious about why people kept certain recipes and not others. The class project prompted parents to ask about their own family recordings. Several families promised to make short explanatory clips to accompany quilts and trunks. That ripple effect, schoolwork producing more explanation, was a cultural shift that, in a modest way, made the idea of convening less idiosyncratic and more like a civic practice. Technology created its own set of choices and tensions. The Trust's 5-year refresh schedule, adopted in 2023, meant that our next major digital migration was due in 2028. In 2025, we began to inventory file formats and consider future codecs. The steward contracted with an archival engineer to create a migration ladder. Analog tapes would have at least 2 digital masters, each stored in geographically separate repositories, with checksums verified annually. The engineer advised that no digital strategy is immutable. Planning for obsolescence is part of stewardship. We budgeted for a 2028 refresh and for a conservative estimate of $7,500 over 5 years to ensure format migrations could proceed. The maintenance fund covered that expense, the steward's annual reports documented the line item, and the siblings' meetings approved it without drama. This procedural maturity, anticipating obsolescence rather than denying it, felt like the direct lineage of Ruth's own insistence on explanation: speak your why and then plan for the future. Not every innovation was uncontroversial. In September 2025, a cousin proposed a microgrant program run out of the maintenance fund to support small convenings for people who could not afford to travel to Flag Street, where the bakery and the archive were based. The idea resembled a community-minded extension of Ruth's will: use the Trust's resources to subsidize the ritual of gathering. The suggestion prompted inevitable questions about scope and beneficiary definition. Who qualified? How did we prevent scope creep? We held a subcommittee and drafted criteria. Grants would be need-based, capped at $250 per convening, and require documentation, an explanation video or a written reflection, for the Trust's archive. The siblings approved this pilot program in November 2025. The pilot's logic tracked Ruth's original move from property to practice. Resources should further the Trust's purposes, not become a substitute for them. Across these administrative shifts, the human economy of memory kept producing moments that were not easily planned. In February 2026, a woman who had been raised in the house and had once stolen a jar as a child returned with her own daughter. The daughter, born after Ruth had died, recognized a recipe card from a slide the high school had shown. They sat at one of Ruth's mismatched chairs, traced the patina, and when the elder woman read Ruth's handwriting aloud, the young girl's face changed in a way that made everyone at the convening hush. It was the recognition of lineage in the absence of a direct line, an inherited method of care intersecting with a new generation's curiosity. My own relationship to the trust oscillated. I did not become its manager. I had never asked to be, and had been named not out of a desire to reward but out of a desire to give voice. That voice had an awkward cadence. I was beneficiary and interpreter, banned from a deathbed and nevertheless charged with ensuring that Ruth's reasons were audible. I sometimes felt the tension of occupying both subject and steward of someone else's explanation. In the summers of 2025 and 2026, I spent weekend shifts at the bakery when the temporary manager, who had been a teenager in Ruth's summer workshops in 2017 and who now ran the ovens on weekdays, offered to teach me pie dough. It was practical, hands-on work that allowed me to participate in the living habit Ruth had left behind without having to narrativize everything. The apron with the recipe card in the pocket remained where it always had, a private artifact that functioned as a prompt rather than a monument. Legally, the trust continued to function as a mechanism for procedural conversation. The language we had interpreted as invitation rather than command had, over the years, been tested in small bureaucratic settings, municipal meetings, conservation applications, and once in a family probate review where an unrelated cousin posed a hypothetical claim. Each test reinforced the same lesson: the trust was not bulletproof, but where disputes arose they were often more limited in scope, more technical in character, and therefore more amenable to mediation than the sweeping emotional fights that an unannotated will could provoke. The local press occasionally returned to our story. A feature in January 2024 in the town paper had framed Ruth's trust as an experiment in eldercare ethics. An op-ed in October 2025 revisited that frame with an emphasis on pedagogy. The papers never turned the matter into a cautionary tale. They tended instead to highlight small civic lessons. Transparency reduces suspicion, named stewards reduce attrition, and explanatory recordings reduce the impulse to ascribe motives. Those reportage moments fed back into public practice. More will writers began suggesting explanatory letters. More attorneys proposed convening clauses as an optional addendum. Still, grief and grievance did not disappear. In late 2025, a distant relative wrote an angry email accusing the trust of performative nostalgia and suggesting that the family preference for explanation thinly veiled an attempt to keep property circulating among insiders. The email roiled a small corner of our online archive comment thread. The steward responded with procedural calm, an invitation to meet, an overview of budgetary transparency, and an offer to include the relative in a convening. The relative did not take up the offer, but the exchange clarified something I had known intuitively: transparency cannot substitute for trust built over time. The trust could make explanation available, but it could not make people choose to trust one another. As the years moved forward, the archival and the domestic slowly braided together. The convenings matured into semi-annual rituals, one in spring, one in late autumn, time to crop cycles Ruth had always observed in her notes. Invitations were mailed, videos were posted in the private cloud for those who could not attend, and small packages, slices of lemon cake frozen, sealed jars, and photocopies of recipes, were dispatched at key moments. The choreography continued to rely on both physical artifacts and explanation. By the start of 2026, the steward had convened 37 meetings since 2019. The trust's ledger recorded the dates, attendees, and a short note about what had been explained at each session. Those notes read like a chronological map of practice: who had reconciled, who had not, what repairs had been made, and what recipes had been rediscovered. The trust's future, like any living instrument, remained open. We had institutionalized many of Ruth's instincts: a rotation plan, scheduled refreshes, a maintenance fund, outreach pilots, but we could not have guaranteed either goodwill or future fidelity. Legal forms are architecture, not conscience. The more consequential work we had learned was cultural and generational, teaching people that leaving explanation is itself an ethical act. Ruth had done that by habit and in handwriting. We were now trying to make that habit legible to others. There were still conversations to be had about who would steward after the successor's 2-year shadow in 2027, how to institutionalize the microgrant pilot if it proved successful, and what to do when the next technological migration came due in 2028. There were also private reckonings, between my parents and me, among cousins, and inside my own head, about what it meant to have been excluded from a final moment and yet entrusted formally, with the future of explanation. I could not unmake what had happened at that deathbed, nor could I expect the trust to do so. What the trust did, and continues to do, is provide a procedural means for the living to gather, to explain, and to decide together. The work ahead was, and remains, to keep that method alive, to ensure the archive is refreshed, the chairs are maintained, the convenings are convened, and the reasons are recorded so that when another generation comes to sit they will find not only objects but the means to understand them and to gather around them in a spirit of shared purpose. By mid-2026, those procedural questions began to harden into a timetable. The steward convened a governance working group in June to map the handover that Ruth's documents had implied but never specified in detail. The successor's 2-year shadow would conclude in 2027, and whoever assumed full responsibility would need both institutional memory and consent from the siblings who had retained a role in oversight. The conversations were practical and chronological: who would learn the password management system by August, who would accompany the archival engineer on a site visit in November, how to record the customary explanation at the spring convening so that it could be indexed in the Trust's catalogue by April 2027. These were not glamorous questions, but they were exactly the kind of administrative choreography Ruth had insisted upon in a letter she had left folded into a recipe box. Do the hard planning now so the later work is possible. The selection process itself was deliberately procedural. In late 2026, the working group circulated a short prospectus describing the steward's responsibilities and the competencies required to manage both the bakery and the archive: familiarity with basic conservation techniques, willingness to convene, and a commitment to annual reporting. Candidates were asked to shadow the incumbent in a series of tasks scheduled between January and June 2027: inventory checks, convening logistics, and the annual checksum verification exercise the archival engineer had prescribed. Those shadow months were to be the successor's 2-year shadow compressed into a transition year. Ruth's papers had asked for a slow handoff, but the family's cultural rhythm required a clearer deadline. In February 2027, the siblings met and ratified the proposed timetable. The vote was unanimous aside from one abstention, registered so as to record dissent without blocking forward motion. Meanwhile, the microgrant pilot that had been approved in November 2025 yielded its first measurable returns to the Trust's purpose. Over the course of 2026, the pilot subsidized several small gatherings. A nephew who could not otherwise have traveled to Flag Street used a grant to convene a learning session on sourdough starter maintenance with 3 neighbors. An elderly neighbor who had kept Ruth's pie tins brought her grandchildren for a weekend of pastry lessons covered partially by the fund. Each grantee produced the required documentation: short explanation videos or written reflections, and those items were accessioned to the archive. In the winter of 2026, the steward presented an interim report to the siblings showing expenditures against the maintenance fund and the archival returns from the pilot. The report concluded what many of us had felt anecdotally: the pilot amplified Ruth's rhetorical project. It did not substitute for the convening, but it lowered a practical barrier to gathering. In December 2026, the siblings authorized a modest expansion of the pilot and asked for a fuller evaluation to be presented alongside the handover materials in mid-2027. Personal dynamics threaded through these institutional movements. My parents and I continued to navigate the stubborn, unresolved business of exclusion and responsibility. I did not expect absolution for being barred from that final room. The Trust's legal architecture had never pretended to be therapeutic. But what the convenings produced, slowly and intermittently, were opportunities. A late summer 2026 session focused on dispute avoidance included a tabletop exercise in which my parents and I were asked to role-play a mediated conversation about the Trust's goals. The exercise did not erase the past. It produced instead a small public acknowledgement of the harms and a commitment, witnessed by cousins and a notary, to use the Trust's dispute resolution clause before taking any matter to court. That clause had been drafted in 2019 with Ruth's encouragement. Words about convening first, litigating last. And in practice it worked as a procedural buffer that directed grievance into scheduled conversation rather than immediate confrontation. The technical work pressed on a parallel track. In late 2026, the archival engineer delivered a revised migration ladder that reflected new codec deprecations and offered a more conservative schedule: create 2 digital masters, store them in geographically separate repositories, verify checksums annually, and maintain a rolling budget for future conversions. The estimate, a reiteration of the $7,500 conservatively budgeted in 2025 for 5 years of migrations, remained the anchor for the ledger.